Here's one way to look at the recent federal election results. About 37 million people live in Canada. That's what this rectangle represents. Of those, about 27 million were registered to vote in the federal election. And there were about 18 million of us that actually voted. Over 6 million people chose Conservative candidates. Almost as many voters chose Liberal candidates. NDP candidates had the support of about half as many voters as Liberals did, and half as many voters chose the Bloc as chose the NDP, while Green voters were nearly as numerous as Bloc voters. If our voting system were an accurate mirror of our political beliefs, we could expect the seats in the House of Commons to look a lot more like what our vote looks like. And while that was more or less true for the Conservatives, it wasn't true for the other parties. The Liberal seat count was higher than the Conservative seat count, even though there are fewer Liberal voters than there are Conservative voters. Liberals hold 6 times as many seats as the NDP, despite having only earned twice as many votes as NDP candidates did. And while the Bloc earned 7 votes for every 6 votes the Greens earned, there will be 10 Bloc MPs for every Green Party MP in Parliament. How could the results look so different than what we voted for? To understand that, we need to go back to our votes. But not all of the votes. In Canadian elections, not everyone who votes affects the outcome of the election. All votes are counted, but not all votes count. Let's call the ones who vote for an MP who ends up sitting in Parliament represented votes. In Canada, most votes are unrepresented. At least that was the case last month, when 51% of votes did not have an impact on the outcome of the election, and it was the case in 2015, when 52% of votes didn't have an impact on the outcome of the election. Meanwhile, in places like New Zealand, where they've made the switch from a system that was virtually identical to ours to a proportional system, the number of unrepresented votes is in the single digits. In Canadian elections, we count our ballots in the simplest way possible. You might say the system is prone to oversimplify our votes. Whichever candidate in a district race collects the most votes ends up in Parliament. The more politically divided a district is, the easier it is for a candidate that most voters don't support to end up in Parliament. Louise Charbonneau recently became the MP-elect for Trois-Rivières after winning a race against 6 other candidates, and she had just 28% of the vote herself. The votes of her opponent's supporters are among the unrepresented. At the district level, this leaves most people without the kind of representation that they asked for. At the national level, our system gives us a parliament that misrepresents, distorts, and oversimplifies who we are as a country. Consider this. There were 346,000 Liberal voters in Alberta and Saskatchewan combined. 1 Liberal voter for every 5 Conservative voters. And not one of the 47 MPs from either province will be a Liberal who sits in the governing party's caucus or has a chance at sitting in cabinet. In the provinces of Newfoundland and Labrador and PEI, 3 voters chose Conservative candidates for every 5 voters who chose Liberals, but none of the 11 MPs for those provinces will be Conservatives. Supporters of regional parties like the Bloc are overrepresented, while millions of NDP and Green voters are underrepresented simply because they don't all live in the same part of the country as one another. Canada is a big country, and it makes sense that there are some strong differences in opinion between people in one part of the country and people in another, and those differences should probably be fairly represented in our parliament. In light of this year's election results, we should probably also be asking ourselves whether it makes sense to cling to a voting system that overrepresents these interests at the expense of national interests, while denying fair representation to millions of voters across the country who just happen to vote differently than many of their neighbors do.